Okay. This name of this lesson is Paul in Greece and Turkey, or how to keep your head down and your chin up. Ann and I flew into Munich from Charlotte on May 25th, and we flew out that evening to Athens. There we met our tour group. This tour was sponsored by Bible Study Fellowship International and had been involved with BSF for years. I just started Bible study with them over the last couple of years. Our tour guides were very knowledgeable of biblical history, the history of ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. The pastor and the biblical historian who accompanied us was a Dr. John Hanna from Dallas Theological Seminary. The title of the tour was The Journeys of Paul. The Apostle Paul was all over the Roman Empire, surrounding the Mediterranean. This is the Roman Empire. You can see, they just wreathed the Mediterranean and the Aegean. This was all the Roman Empire. And Paul was all over, as you see in his 3 or 4, missions. It was all over the Roman Empire. These people, we think of it as ancient, being the first century, but most of the sailing was done within sight of land. There were some people who had navigational abilities, but you could see how boats could just move all along here. People book a boat here, a boat from here, a boat to there, a boat to there. So they were all around the Mediterranean. He went back and forth between places. If there had been frequent sailing miles, he would have had a bunch of them. I'll be showing a few pictures of this, but this is not Rick Steves. This is about the Apostle Paul. Who was Paul? Paul was born around 5 AD into a well-respected family in Tarsus in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. Go there. There's Greece. This is Asia Minor over here across the Aegean Sea. This is Turkey. There is now he was born. Sorry, it's not on the map. He was born further down here, the southern part of Turkey, in Tarsus. His family was not rich, but he received an excellent education studying in Jerusalem under one of the leading Jewish teachers of that time, Gamaliel. Paul spoke Greek. He would have been very aware of the works of the great Greek philosophers such as Plato and Socrates. This was a sophisticated man. He was a tent maker, likely, using wool prepared in Asia Minor. By the standards of his time, would have been considered a sophisticated man of the world. And he was a Pharisee. Pharisees were members of a sect that believed in the resurrection and in following legal traditions that were ascribed not only to the Torah, but to the traditions of the fathers. They, as were the scribes, were the well-known legal experts at the time in the Jewish community. Paul was 28 at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He took an active role in the apprehension and persecution of the new religious sect called Christians. He looked on with approval at the stoning of Stephen, recognized as the first Christian martyr. He was headed to Damascus. Damascus is the oldest city in the world. Damascus, Syria. He was headed to Damascus to apprehend more Christians when he had his encounter with Christ. The encounter changed his life, and as he recounts many times in Scripture, it defined the remainder of his life. Paul in Greece and Turkey. So there we are in Athens. There we are in Athens. I'm sorry, these aren't the greatest pictures, but there we are in Athens, and that's the Acropolis. You can't miss it, and Paul wouldn't have missed it. If you're in Athens, you're going to see that thing up there. It's Acropolis up on the top. This happens to be a shot, I think, from our hotel, but everybody can see it. There's Parthenon up there. But the most prominent site in Athens is the Acropolis, a large hill on the outskirts of the city. can't be avoided. If there is, up there is the Pantheon. An ancient Greek amphitheater. The Pantheon was an ancient Greek temple, Parthenon, was an ancient Greek temple dedicated to the Greek goddess Athena, built in the 5th century BC. Paul saw all of these, and they were partially in ruins. But one point I wanted to make that the Romans had a tremendous respect for Greek culture. They may have conquered the Romans, they may have conquered Greece, but for their architecture and their culture, the Romans had a great deal of respect and fondness for Greek culture. They were the 4th century. For these buildings, the Greeks had built in the 4th century during the height of the Greek or Hellenic Empire. Earthquakes and war had ravaged them. The Romans were now in charge. Athens enjoyed a special relationship with Rome. They were independent of the rule from Corinth, and they did not have to pay taxes to Rome. You might say the Romans were Grecophiles, admiring Greek culture. Corinth was now the commercial center, but the intellectual leaders were Athens, the city where once Plato, Aristotle, Socrates lectured. They felt they had the answers on all the essential questions of life. Corinth is where Paul stayed with his fellow Christian tent makers, Priscilla and Aquila. Paul left Silas and Timothy in Berea, up in northern Greece. Before that, the Jews had kicked them out of Thessalonica. The brethren in Berea put Paul on a boat from Athens, fearing for his life. He's in Athens with a few Christians he does not know. He goes up to the Acropolis to look around. Who wouldn't? Luke tells us in Acts 17 what Paul did when he was left alone. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. He argued against this to Jews and God-fearing Gentiles in the synagogue. There were people, obviously, who were not Jewish people, who did not believe in pantheism. They recognized that there was a God, that there was a one true God. And their only access to that was in the synagogue from the Jews. So even though they weren't Jews, they were God-fearing people. And they went to synagogue. He spoke against the idols in the Agora, the classic Roman marketplace. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a temple to Athena. Now this, a lot of tourists there, but this is a picture of an Agora. The Romans had these long paved areas, and what was here, now these are just ruins, but you see the columns. Well, the columns were there, and then there was a roof over it. And so this was the marketplace. But it wasn't just a marketplace, they did a lot of other things. This is a classic Roman Agora.
But you're in Greece.
That's Ephesus.
Are we still in Greece? This picture?
We're in Greece.
Okay, but it was a Roman style.
Roman style. That's what I'm saying, and you're right, but they all looked alike. Just like if you've seen one Roman amphitheater, you've seen them all. Now, although the Agora began as an area where people gathered to buy and sell, it eventually became one of the focal points in most communities. The Agoras were often paved with colonnaded walkways, monuments, and sculptures. You can see there would often be sculptures along here too of famous people, famous generals. Often a Bema or a speaker's platform. Yeah. Okay, There it is. Often there was a Bema or a speaker's platform would be erected in the marketplace. The local magistrate would use the location to sit and judge administrative matters. And there is, in fact, that even says Bema on there. Later, Paul would be hauled into the Bema, or the quote judgment seat in Corinth. Besides the shops and offices, there were usually public latrines nearby. We got to definitely get a shot of that.
No, that's not it.
Where are they? Oh, missed it. I don't know how I missed it, but I'm glad I missed it.
Oh, Don, you missed the one.
Sorry.
You missed it. You missed it.
I had a shot of it. No, I'm sorry.
We'll find an original.
Yeah, okay, we'll get it. So Paul stood up at the meeting, or, oh, we're going to show you. So he seemed, I'm sorry, besides the shops and offices, there were usually public latrines, as I said. It was here that Paul's arguments against pantheism and for the one true God were heard by the leading thinkers of Athens. They complained, what is this bumbler trying to say? He seems to be advocating for foreign gods. Paul made his way I'm so sorry. Maybe it'll come up later. I'm sorry. I was going to show you the Areopagus, which is just a large hill. In fact, the other name for it is Mars Hill. It's just a large outcropping up at the Acropolis. And this is where oftentimes they would try serious legal cases. And Paul was asked there. He made his way there. He obviously knew where the real thinkers were and the important people of the town that he wanted to address about what he saw. May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Acts goes on to say that although the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent all their time doing nothing but listening to and discussing all the latest ideas, Acts 17 goes on to say, Paul then stood up in the meeting at Mars Hill and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way that you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at the objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you're ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in a temple built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needs anything. Rather, he himself gives life to everyone, life and breath and everything else. Paul left Athens for Corinth, just south of Athens, and so did we, only we took a bus. Paul departed Athens, went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, and born in Pontus, which is in Italy. He recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, the emperor, had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. So those guys would get kicked out of every place all the time. And amazing. Kicked out of Spain, got kicked out of Italy. And he came to them. So because he was in the same trade, they were all tent makers, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation, they were tent makers. And he resided in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So that's what I'm referring to, the non-Jewish, God-fearing people who would refer to them as the Greeks. He testified to the Jews in the synagogue that Jesus was the Christ. They accused him of blasphemy. Paul's fed up, shakes his clothes, and says, your blood be on your heads, which is to say, they are the authors of their own ruin and destruction. He went through that several times. Finally saying that his major message is going to go to the non-Jewish God-fearing people. The Jews attack Paul. They go to the newly appointed Roman proconsul there in Corinth. Gallio, interestingly, is the Roman proconsul. Interestingly enough, he's the older brother of the famous Roman poet Seneca. Gallio hears the Jews' argument that Paul is encouraging them to worship a god other than the emperor, contrary to the law. Gallio dismisses it as a minor religious issue. The Jews take their anger out on the fellow named Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, by beating him in the Bema. God speaks to Paul in a dream, telling him not to be afraid, that he will not be harmed. Paul stayed in Corinth for over a year. Corinth was rich. It was also nasty, worldly, cynical place. Temple of Aphrodite was there. See that? That's our ship. That's our boat. We were on a 4-masted schooner. It was an ice boat. Oh, that's still not. Maybe later. I'm sorry. No, I don't want to do that. The temple of Aphrodite was there. The temple of Aphrodite was there in Corinth with their 1,000 prostitutes to service those who came to worship. He leaves there for Ephesus.
I saw it coming.
He leaves the rich Corinthian leather. You remember that? It was totally made up. No such thing as Corinthian leather. Anyway, the temple of Aphrodite was there with 1,000 prostitutes to service the worshipers. He leaves there for Ephesus. Later, he writes a letter from there to the church of Corinth, and then another from Macedonia, again to the church in Corinth. He admits that he was scared in Corinth. On a lighter note, we sailed from Athens to Philippi, to northern Greece, which is so this is Greece. This is there's Athens. This is Corinth. This part's called the Peloponnesus. It used to be called Peloponnesus. Yeah, there's a connection there between them. And then this northern Greece is referred to as Macedonia. And this is where Philippi is. Later, he admits that he was scared in Corinth, as I said. On the lighter note, we sailed from Athens to Philippi in northern Greece, which is ancient Macedonia. This is where we encounter our beloved Lydia. Yeah, except there were no references to tattoos or Groucho Marx.
Maybe you got the wrong version.
Maybe it's-
I'll sing it for you sometime.
This Lydia was a successful business lady who traded in purple dye and was a God-fearing Gentile. There were Greeks who, likely from the Jews in the synagogues, that had learned about the only true God. Paul encounters her with her entourage praying at the riverbank. Oh, there's the latrines. That takes some getting used to. Take a newspaper.
Oh,
Yeah.
scroll.
There's your progress. That's your progress. So I'm trying to get, here we are. There we are. He preached the good news and they accepted Christ. They were baptized at the river. And our group took communion there. Right at the... Now, Later, Paul and Silas were accosted by a girl who shouts at them, you may remember this story, that they are servants of the Most High God who shows us the way to salvation. She has the reputation of as a soothsayer, and her masters make a lot of money offering her services. You'd think that Paul would have been flattered, but he takes pity on her, and he commands in the name of Jesus Christ that the spirit come out of her. It does, and her masters are angry. They take Paul and Silas before the magistrate in the marketplace, back to the judgment seat for Paul and Silas, and they're in prison. And that's what's supposed to be what remains of that prison. You may recall what happened. While in prison, there's an earthquake. The prison door flies open and their chains fall away. All the while, Paul and Silas remain there and sing psalms. The prison guard assumes that all the prisoners have escaped and that they will be executed, that he will be executed as a punishment. He's prepared to take his own life when he's confronted by Paul and Silas. It's one of those moments. He knows that he wants what those guys had, that spiritual clarity that can only come from Christ. He asks them what he must do to be saved. The guard and his whole family accept Christ and are baptized. The magistrates who had Paul and Silas beaten and imprisoned are apprised that Paul and Silas are both Roman citizens. The officials know that they're in hot water. They beg Paul and Silas to accept their apologies, and they leave, which they do. Lastly, we set sail for Ephesus. Share fast forward. This is Ephesus here. Now, this is an ancient map, and this is Ephesus. Actually, Ephesus, the river silted in here. Ephesus is anywhere between 3 and 5 miles away from the coast. At the time, the first century, it was on the coast. As I said, ancient Ephesus was a Greek city. This was part of Greek at the time. Now it's part of Turkey. It's Asia Minor, but it was a Greek city taken over by the ancient Roman Empire. It now lies in Turkey, previously called Anatolia. Ephesus was as I said, I told you that we had to disembark at a place called Kudasi, which is over on the coast, and we took a bus into Ephesus. Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus, and we were there several times. He considered this his ministry in Asia. He preached, and in chapter 19 of Acts says that God gave him the power to perform. It says that God gave him the power to perform miracles. It says in verse 12 that handkerchiefs and aprons that had been merely touched Paul had the power to heal others. Some itinerant Jews were going around casting out evil spirits in the name of Christ. A leading priest named Shiva had 7 sons who decided to go into the business casting out demons. With the last guy they tried it on, the evil spirit said, "I know Jesus and I know Paul, but who are you?" The evil spirits ran them off naked and battered. This got around. There was a massive conversion to Christ. Many of the local sorcerers came to accept Christ and brought their incantation books to be burned. The Bible states the books at that time were estimated to be worth 100,000 days of wages. And yet these guys burned them and accepted Christ. People in those days may not have taken vacations, but they took pilgrimages. Actually, that's what we were doing. In Ephesus, people from every empire came to worship the god Artemis or Diana. This is Ephesus, and that's like I said, one amphitheater looks like another. That's Artemis, the god of the hunt. And the temple of Artemis was a statue of Artemis made partly from a meteorite. And this is one of the reasons people thought that this came from the gods and came because it had fallen out of the sky, indicating its divine origin. The silversmiths of Ephesus did a brisk business in making take-home statues of Artemis. Paul spoke out in Ephesus, saying that gods made from human hands are not God. This inflamed the silversmith guild, and there was a riot. Paul boarded ship for Macedonia. So this trip was about Paul of Tarsus, formerly a devout Jewish Pharisee. He had great credentials, and for a Jew in Jerusalem under the Roman rule, he was top tier. Why did he devote the best years of his life to taking such risks in such a dangerous world? Why did he never waver? Where would we be if Jesus had not stopped Paul on that road? But he did. He armed this this normal human with courage, humility, insight, and an incorruptible faith as a model for us all. Paul, if you're listening, thank you for what your life and what your words have taught us.
Amen. John.